We are Life Church Livonia.
Today, we celebrate. We celebrate the 19 people that have given their lives to Christ here since last September, and the 107 that have given their lives to Jesus since we started 4 years ago. We celebrate the 15 people who have been baptized at our church this year, and the 23 people that have been baptized over the past 4 years. We celebrate the 115 people that engaged in discipleship through our small groups this year, and the 22 people who led them. We celebrate the 135 people that make it all possible. We celebrate you. We celebrate us. We celebrate Life Church Livonia.
How cool is that? I love it. The only not cool part about it is that it's wrong. There's more people that have given their life to Christ because since we made the video, we've had 3 more people commit their lives to follow Jesus. And so that's a big deal, all right? And we don't take that lightly. And so it's actually 110, and instead of 19, it's 22. God is doing great things in our midst. And I just am so proud to be a part of this and to be a part of a family with you guys. And so thank you so much for the way that you give, the way that you've committed, the way that we have partnered together for the sake of the good news of Jesus Christ. I really believe that God changes lives. And so as we live into those lives and what it looks like to be changed by Jesus, we have to dig into hard topics. And so over the last couple weeks, starting last week and then now continuing today, we've been in the midst of a series called How to Neighbor. And so really this is at its core, it's going back to a conversation that Jesus had about 2,000 years ago. So there's a 2,000-year-old conversation that Jesus had with a Jewish expert in the law, that Jesus had with an individual who was a religious leader that brought clarity to kind of what Jesus was all about. But I think it also brings clarity to us today. It still applies to you and I today. And so my hope for you in the midst of the series is if you're not a believer, if you're just checking out Life Church Livonia, or you're checking out Christianity in general, that this series would kind of clarify for you what it looks like to be a Jesus follower. That maybe you've been looking at us from the outside in, and now you're sitting here in a church and you're wondering, what is this all about? And my hope is that this would kind of paint a really clear picture of at least part of what it is to be a Christian. And then conversely, if you all are already following Jesus, that what this series would do for you is it would bring a reminder of what's at the core, of what it looks like to be a good neighbor. And so what I want to do is to make sure that we're all on the same equal playing field. I'm going to go back into that text. We preached from the same text last week to make sure you understand what was that conversation that Jesus had with this guy. It's found in Luke chapter 10. It says this: on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" So Jesus, in classic Jesus form, he responds with a question instead of answering it. He says, "What is written in the law?" He replied. "How do you read it?" And he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." So once again, this is a beautiful moment of clarity when Jesus himself confirms what is at the heart of the gospel, what is at the heart of what it looks like to find life in him. And the name of our church is Life Church Livonia because we believe that Jesus does bring us life and bring it to the full. And here's the answer. He says, yeah, if you do these things, if you love God and you love people, you'll find life. This is really crystal clear here. But as we saw last week, the expert in the law wasn't content with that. He wasn't willing to just accept that, to receive it and walk away, even though it was him that gave the answer. He's the one that said, well, Jesus, it's all about loving God and loving your neighbor. And he went on and he said, well, who is my neighbor? The text says that he wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus a question in return. I think part of it is that he was a little bit annoyed that Jesus asked him a question in return, so he's like, I'm going to have the last word. I'm going to ask Jesus a question now. And so he thinks he's going to be clever, but really he is setting himself up to put his foot in his mouth. Who is my neighbor, he says. And the way that he asked this question revealed a significant amount about him as a person, because it becomes really clear that the reason he asked the question is that he wanted to know who he was allowed to exclude from the list of people he had to neighbor. What he's really asking is, who do I not have to love? Like, I get the whole love God thing, but loving people, there's some people I'd rather leave off that list. It's an age-old problem. It was old when Jesus had this conversation, and it will continue to be an issue as long as there are human beings drawing breath on this planet, that there are some people that just don't do well together. People that don't mix. It's like oil and water. People that move in next to you or get the job in your same division, or you go to school with, or that you are related to, that you're just like, I get this whole thing about loving God and people, but the people are what make it difficult. And so we struggle to live out the call to love our neighbor because our neighbors are not always easy for us to love. It's hard because they look different than us. They think differently than us. They require us to expend energy, to expend time and resources that if we were honest, we would much rather spend either on ourselves or on people that we actually enjoy being with. Have you ever left a gathering of people and you just go home and you're like, oh my goodness, I just want to lay on the couch? Not because you didn't get enough sleep the night before or you ate too much casserole, but because the people just sucked the life out of you. These are the people that the expert in the law wanted Jesus to give him permission to leave off the list. And Jesus wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. He said, no, you don't understand. They all belong on the list. Even those people that push you out of your comfort zone, the ones that cause you to think about someone other than yourself. The expert in the law was missing the point, and my hope that in the midst of the series that we wouldn't miss it too. And so last week, as we began this series talking about how we tend to leave people off the list, we started with a really tough topic, and we started with racism. And the way that race plays a role in how we exclude people from being our neighbor. How we leave people out when it comes to how we love. And I got to be honest with you, it was actually one of the most emotional sermons that I've ever preached personally. It was a hard sermon to preach for me. And I'm glad we did it. And what I would encourage you to do is if you weren't here last week, it's online where you can watch the video because it's an important part of what makes Life Church Livonia tick. It's part of the core of what we value here is that we want to become a church that is not just multiracial, but is multicultural. And if we're going to become that, we have to learn how to neighbor people that look and think and act differently than us. We live in a city that is, at one point, was the whitest city in America, over 100,000 in the nation. And so it'd be really easy for us to be a church that is all monocultural and monoethnic, but we do not want to be that, and we aren't that. But I want to continue to grow in that area, so I encourage you, if you weren't here, go and check out the sermon on what it looks like to love our neighbor and push through racism as one of the barriers. But this week, we continue. And we continue to ask the question, who is my neighbor? By honestly turning our eyes to the most vulnerable among us. Because we live out what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves when every single orphan is embraced. When every single orphan is embraced, we'll know that we are killing it when it comes to loving our neighbor as ourselves. Because in the same way that we can't be a good neighbor and be racist at the same time, we also can't be a good neighbor while allowing hundreds of thousands of children to go without a safe family to call their own. And we see it really clearly in the writings of James, the brother of Jesus. It's really clear. He writes a letter just a few decades after Jesus' death and his resurrection. And as I was reading this passage once again, it struck me, something really struck me here, that James and Jesus were really, they were kind of an interesting family. Because if you think about it, Joseph adopted Jesus. Joseph wasn't Jesus' dad. He adopted him. And so James writes this as the brother of someone who was adopted into the family. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be Jesus' brother? It's like I grew up being known as Brenda's little brother. Imagine if you were Jesus' brother. That would be tough stuff. Well, look at Jesus. Look at what Jesus did. So listen, he knows what it's like to have an adopted child in his family. And so he writes this verse in James 1:27, and he says this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And so we could talk about a whole lot of things here. We could talk about what it looks like to keep ourselves from being polluted by the world. We could talk about what it looks like to care for widows. But what I want to do today is lean into the call to look after the orphans, because James brings the truth hard. He brings it hard. He says, just because you seem to be pretty good at doing this whole religion thing doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing it in a way that God our Father accepts. Doesn't mean that you're doing it in a way that God looks at and says, man, you're killing that religion thing. You're killing that church thing. Just because you think you're doing a good job, it doesn't mean that you're pure and faultless in that way. And James kind of pulls the veil back, and he honestly drops the mic. He says, I see you. I see you going to church sometimes. I see you dropping a buck in the plate sometimes. I see you cleaning up your tongue and the way you talk around your pastor sometimes. I see you guys out there. I see you lifting your hands and singing during worship. It's good stuff. I see you praying when life gets hard. All of that is good stuff. But I also see you walking right past people that I call you to be a good neighbor to, that I call you to love, including orphans, including widows. This is what James is saying to the church. And his words ring out as true all the way until today. So what I want to do for a little while today is just tell my story. And what I don't want this to be is a sermon all about Brian and the way that I'm killing this, because I have all sorts of issues in my life as well where I struggle to do life the way Jesus calls me to do it. But for today, my story I think is important because I've always been moved by this verse. Always. I would read this and I would say, man, I believe that, Jesus, and I want to do it the way you call us to do it. And so it's always moved me. But in some ways, what I did for most of my adult life is I only practiced this verse a couple of weeks a year. I spent about almost 20 years as a youth pastor. And one of the things I did during that time is I would lead teams of students and young adults around the globe engaging in mission efforts. And for the most part, every time we would go somewhere, whether it was Central America or Mexico or Africa or some of the Caribbean islands, no matter where we went, most of the ministry that we did targeted orphans and widows. It was at the core of my passion to reach the lost and to care for the vulnerable and to live out this verse. So no matter where we were, whether we're deep in the mountains of Jamaica, or we are in the middle of the desert in Africa, whether we were sitting on the corner of a street in some slum of a great city like Nairobi, or we were in the middle of the kind of the outback on a farm, we would sit and we would go through this text. James 1:27. And I would look at the students, or I would look at these college students, and I would say to them, listen, what we're doing, yesterday what you were doing is this. You were living into religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless. Some of the translations say worship that God our Father accepts is this. So I would tell these students, yesterday when you were playing with those children, when you were caring for the orphans, you were worshiping. And God smiles down on what you were doing. And I was right. It was good. It was beautiful. It was pure and faultless. And there were so many incredible things that came as a result of those trips Countless trips all over the world, doing great things, building orphanages and caring for children and rebuilding homes for widows. We did incredible ministry. But then what would happen is that we would come home. And the question became, well, what about the rest of the year? And for myself, it was almost like I had checked a box off on the list of following Jesus. Killed it. Check. Did my part. And then I would wait again until next year or another trip to do it again. And so would my students. And honestly, I was certain that I had to leave the country to go to a developing country outside of the United States in order to find orphans to care for. And I was incredibly wrong. Incredibly wrong. And what happens is that because the United States doesn't have a traditional orphanage system, and instead what we have is a foster care network, because of that, it's really easy for us to believe that our country is void of any orphaned children, that we don't have an orphan problem, that we don't have any kind of individuals or children that we can engage in the way James 1:27 calls us to do it. It's really easy to convince ourselves that we have to leave the country in order to do what God calls us to do. But let me give you some staggering facts about this. This is the latest statistics I could find on this were just a couple of years old with some projections of what it will look like this year. But the latest stats say that about 428,000 children are in foster care in the U.S. alone. 428,000 children who either don't have a home because their parents have passed away tragically, or because their parents are incarcerated, or because their parents are incapable of caring for them well, or just aren't safe for them to be around. 428,000 children in the U.S. alone. Almost 500,000 children. If you took the 4 largest football stadiums in the United States and you packed them to complete capacity with these children, you still would not have enough room for all of them. And this year, there will be an estimated, of those 428,000, 102,000 of them will need a permanent home. It won't just be a temporary thing for them. What that means is that 100,000 children this year will need a place that they can go to permanently because they do not have anywhere else that they can go. Nowhere else they can go that's safe. And it's not just a California problem or a Texas problem or a New York City problem. It's not just an urban core problem. It's a nationwide problem. Michigan will have an estimated 12 to 15,000 children in need of foster care this year, just in the state of Michigan. And we are far from the biggest state. Just population-wise, we are far from the biggest state. And over 3,000 of those children here in Michigan will need a permanent home this year. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking when you go on to the Michigan Adoption Resource Exchange website and you see page after page after page after page of children and their pictures and a little bit of their story and little videos that say, this is what I'm looking for in a family. It's heartbreaking when you go back onto that exact same page year after year, which I've done and I shouldn't do because it breaks me every time, and I see the same children on there. There's a family of 3 kids I saw on there this week that their pictures have been on that website looking for a forever family for 5 years. 5 years. 428,000 children in foster care in the U.S. And about 10 years ago, I came home from another one of those trips with the Lord really digging into me, like poking at me, asking me a seriously annoying and repetitive question. He kept saying to me over and over again, what about the children here in the States, Brian? And I was like, what about them, Lord? I'm doing my part. I'm killing it. He's like, what about the children here in the United States, Brian? I'm like, what about them, Lord? I'm doing my part. And he wouldn't let me go. He wouldn't let me go. And everywhere I went, I ran into people who were opening up their homes for children to come into permanently. Everywhere, I was like, I feel like the Lord was stalking me. I think he was. He said, Brian, I want you to do something. I want you to do something serious and life-changing. I want you to open your home up. And my wife was on that page way before I was. I got to give her credit. She was there. The Lord said it to her, and she was like, okay, Lord. And the Lord said it to me, and I was like, I don't know about that, Lord. That's confession hour. I'm not proud of that. But our hearts became united around that, and we decided we wanted to open our home. So we did, foster care first, and then ultimately to adoption. And this isn't all about me, but I think my story is in some ways typical of a lot of people's stories because we check the box off, and we feel good about ourselves, and we miss potentially something God's calling us to do. And not only could I not escape relationally from people that were doing this, but I also couldn't escape biblically. As I read verses like James 1:27, or I read other verses like Psalm 82, verses 3 through 4. Listen to this. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. I would read these verses and I could hear God saying, I want you to do this. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. There is nothing confusing about the Lord's heart for the fatherless. There is nothing unclear about God's heart for the oppressed, for the orphan, for the needy. So who is America's version of the orphan? In many cases, it's maybe even a child that lives in your neighborhood. It's a child that goes to your kid's school or catches a bus on your street. It's a child that comes to church here occasionally or maybe every week. They're all around us. 12 to 15,000 right here in the state of Michigan. Listen to what Jed Medifine, he's the president of Christian Alliance for Orphans. Listen to what he says about this. Though the statistics are staggering, behind each number is a real child with a unique and painful story. To be sure, orphans in any context are the most vulnerable people in the world, and God has specifically tasked the church with the responsibility of caring for orphans from hard places. This matchless beauty, this unspeakable pain, all woven together, this is at the root of God's love for the orphan. It is his invitation to each of us as well. So let me be really clear here. Really, this is super important. I want you to hear this, is that not everyone should run out and adopt a child. Not everyone here should get up and sign up today. Not everyone should jump into foster care. This is a unique calling, and it is a difficult calling. And while it may sound easy, you're like, well, I've had kids before. I could do this. No problem. It's easy. No, it's not. It is one of the most difficult things that I've ever done and may ever do. It requires special training. It requires an incredible amount of time. It requires a willingness to be an advocate for your child in a way that you've never experienced before in your entire life. It requires you to learn to knit together something that maybe came from the outside and now has been implanted into you. And it's not always easy. If God is calling you to do this, then you have to do it. You have to do it. Trust me, if you don't, God will stalk you like he did me. If God is calling you to do it, you have to do it. And some of you know that it's you and you've been wrestling with this for a while. You've longed to do this for a while, but you've been resistant to do it, and you have a long list of reasons why you just couldn't or shouldn't, but you know God's calling you to do it. And if that's you, I want to encourage you to seriously lean back into prayer again, to seriously consider what that might look like. And some of you have already responded to that calling, just like my family did. We have a church full of people that have done this already. And I want you to know that we see you and we love you and we are there with you. But if you are still in that place of resistance, talk to me. I'll connect you with other people that have done it. We're going to have opportunities today for an organization called Vista Maria to be here. You can talk to them about what it looks like to be a part of the foster care network or to look at adoption. We'll connect you with the right people. There's other organizations out there that you can talk to. You can explore this. And I can promise you, if you say yes, I can promise you two things. Beyond a shadow of doubt, I know that this is true. A, it won't be easy. But B, the child is worth it. The child is worth it. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. I can go back again, year after year, I look at it again and we say, was it easy? No. Is it worth it? Absolutely. And even though everyone can't adopt and everyone can't foster, everyone can and should do something. Something. We can all engage some way. And so if God isn't calling you to be the one who opens up your home and invites children in and makes them a part of your family, maybe God's calling you to be a part of it in some different way. Maybe God's calling you to invest in the lives of other people who have done that. Maybe God's calling you to volunteer here at Life Kids so that when we bring those children here, when we make them a part of our family at home, they can come here and feel a part of a family here. I would love it if we had a waiting list to serve in Life Kids, because people are living out this call in their lives. I would love that if Steve, who does our Life Kids directing, if he had to come up on stage and say, hey, thank you people for volunteering for Life Kids, but we have no more room. That'd be amazing. And we'd be the first church in the history of churches that have ever had to do that. True story. I would love that. So what if you aren't in a space where you can open your home up? What can you do? I want to give you a few next steps. And the first is this. Walk alongside of those of us who have opened up our homes. Choose to walk alongside. You can do it a lot of different ways. You can help create space for families to have date nights or fun nights out by contributing to childcare or offering it up yourself. Some of you have done this really well. And on behalf of everyone who has ever adopted or done foster care, I want to say thank you. This is a big deal. Doing childcare and having date nights is significantly more difficult for those of us who do this. It is way more difficult, and so to walk alongside of people in that way is a huge deal. Maybe that's not your calling. Maybe what you need to do is intentionally connect with those who are fostering and adopting, even to find out how you can pray for them. You wouldn't believe how much it means to us when people come up to us and they say, hey, we're praying for you. How can we cover you in prayer as you walk this journey? Maybe you need something more tangible, and maybe what you need to do is volunteer at Royal Family Kids Camp. This is a nationwide ministry, and what they do is they take children who are either in the foster care system or are orphans in some way, and they take them out of their really difficult context, and they take them to camp for a week. It's an incredible ministry where a lot of these children have never experienced anything like this in their entire lives. The things that we take for granted, they've never even experienced. And we're going to have representatives from Royal Family Kids Camp here today. And this is an opportunity for you to be a camp counselor for a week. There's ways you can plug in to do that. There's ways that you can be a part of their support network. You can help them in their fundraising efforts. You can donate to what they do. Royal Family Kids Camp is an incredible ministry, and we have people in our church that are passionate about this and have volunteered in this area for years. My family that I married into, Jamie's family, did this in Colorado for years. Rebecca Kaiser, who is married to Jeff, who's on staff here, she was a part of it in Alaska. It's all over the place, and it's an active way you can step in and love orphans and live into James 1:27 and our calling to be a neighbor. You could do that, or you could contribute financially to organizations and individuals who care for orphans. It can be expensive. Or you can do all of the above. And what I want to encourage you to do is to be a neighbor. Because investing in the life of one child, it won't necessarily change the world, but it will change that child's world. It will change that child's world. The gospel is clear. What it looks like to be a neighbor. Last week, it's that every tribe and tongue and nation needs to be gathered together. The dividing walls of hostility between races and ethnic groups need to be torn down, but we also need to tear down the fences we build around our homes and our families and let children in who have nowhere to go. Because this is what God has done for us. God has adopted us into as a family. He said, I want to call you son. I want to call you daughter. I want to make you a part of my family. Ephesians 1:5 says that God decided in advance to adopt us into his family by bringing him to himself through Jesus Christ. And in the New Living Translation, it says, this is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. God says, I see you struggling to live life to the full. I see you struggling to do it all on your own, and I want to adopt you into my family. And so not only is it God's heart for us to live into this and do this, it's God's heart to do it for you and I, to draw us close to himself and give us love and grace and safety in a way that we can't experience without him. It's at the heart of the gospel. It's at the heart of who Jesus is. And it's at the heart of this table. As we go into communion and we realize that really this is a table that's for family. And Jesus says, come and eat with me. Be a part of my family. And so we go back, we look back to the night that he was gathered with the disciples that were really his family on earth. And he took bread and after blessing it, he broke it. And he said, this is my body broken for you. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup and he said, this cup is my blood poured out for you. And as often as you eat the bread and you drink this cup, you proclaim my death until I come again. As often as you do this, as you sit with family, you remember that I adopted you, and I would do it over and over and over again. As often as you eat the bread and you drink the cup, you remember that it wasn't easy for Jesus to do what he did, but he would do it again. Because you are worth it. You are worth it. And you're on his list already of those who deserve love. And so today we invite you, if you are part of that family, if you've said yes to being a part of Jesus' family, we invite you. In a few moments, the ushers are going to come and they're going to pass little crackers that are gluten-free so that everyone can enjoy. They're going to pass little cups of juice. You can just take it, and when you are ready, you can eat and you can drink. We invite you into that space. And we invite you to come not because you must, but because you can. Because you may. Because you are part of God's family. And if you aren't, I want to invite you today to join us. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we worship you in this place. Thanking you, God, that not only do you model for us what it looks like to draw people into a family, but you empower us with everything we need so that we can do it too. Jesus, there are people here right now in this space who know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is them that you are calling to open their home. It's them that you're calling to do this. And they're scared. And they're worried. And they have a list of reasons why they haven't done it yet. God, today I pray that you would gently and lovingly tear down those barriers. Remove the obstacles between them and stepping into your will for their lives so that they might do this. Empower them, equip them, embolden them today, God. And God, there's others in our midst right now who are hearing us talk about what it looks like to be a part of God's family, and they've never experienced that for themselves. And if that's you, I just invite you right now in the quiet of your own heart to just pray and say, Jesus, I want to be a part of that family. I want to be a part of your family. I choose to receive your invitation to be your son or your daughter. I choose to receive from you the forgiveness of all of the mistakes I've made and the mess I've made of my life. I choose to receive everything that you are. And God, I long to experience life with you. I choose you today. I commit myself to being a part of your family, God, today. Jesus, bless this table, the bread and the cup. Help us to not receive these elements of worship in an unworthy manner, to do so with a pure and clean heart as we learn to do your will daily. We love you. Commit this time and this space to you in the name of Jesus. Amen.